Now I go to talk about fundamental concepts in environmental remediation and decommissioning. I do that because there are many circumstances in which people do not really digest and understand the kind of framework that need to be applied in these circumstances. And I'm speaking about the position of the IAEA in this regard. It's not, may not be the position of your countries. You may decide to have different approaches. But as an IAEA staff, I'm pretty much sharing with you the positions of the IAEA standards. And when I talk about IAEA standards, it's important to understand that IAEA does not decide anything per se. The IAEA facilitates the consensus among different member states. So the positions that I'll be discussing with you now are the positions where consensus was found among the different member states that participated in the elaboration of these gold standards. But let me go back in the past. It's always interesting to go back in the past to see where things started and where we are now, so that we can understand the evolution of things. So back in 1895, Huntington discovered the X-rays. I will not go into details of how this happened. The identification of radioactivity with Becquerel in 1896, and then Marie Curie discovered the radium in 1898, and all these discoveries definitely led to many cases of radiation damage because people were not aware of what they were working with, right? Injuries were caused, and pay attention to what I said before. I'm talking about injuries. So injuries are associated with deterministic effects, things that you can link between the cause and the effect. So this is damages that could be observed. And it has been understood that these effects could be lethal, depending on the doses where people were exposed to. The effects could lead to the death of the person that was exposed. 1 year after Huntington's discovery of X-ray, Paul van Vught gave what is generally recognized as the first protection advice. Pay attention to this. This is very interesting. First of all, make the exposure as short as possible. So this is the time dimension of exposure to radiation. If you reduce the time of exposure, you reduce the risk. Number one approach for radiation protection. Do not stand within 30 centimeters of the X-ray tube. So this is the distance. The exposure decreases with the square of the distance, right? And coat the skin with Vaseline and leave an extra layer on the most exposed area. So this is the principle of shielding. So the 3 principles of radiation of protection were laid down already in 1896, right? So these are the basic tenets of practical radiological protection: time, distance, and shielding. We've just improved those things. So if there is a radiation source that you are exposed to, try to make the exposure as short as possible, try to keep distance, and try to find protection against that. In the early 1920s, radiation protection regulators were prepared in several countries. So we are talking about 1920. But it was not until 1925 that the first International Congress of Radiology, ICR, took place, and considering establishing international protection standards. So you can see what this ICR will be turned to. So we are talking about things that were already known in the 2 centuries 24 hours, and some protection was started to be established in 1925. The first ICR was held in London in 25, and most pressure issue was what was quantifying radiation, measurements of radiation. We need to quantify the measures of radiation. So that was in 1925. And that was the creation of International Commission of Radiation Units and Measure, ICRU, although it was then named International X-ray Unit Committee, because at that time X-ray was the main issue that was in the mind of the people. The second ICR was held in Stockholm, 1928, and ICU proposed the adoption of the Röntgen unit, which is what I mentioned in my previous slides. And then after the Second World War, the first post-war ICR was convened in London in 1950. The ICR was named ICRP, that we know today, ICRP, International Commission on Radiological Protection. So you see the creation of things. 6 subcommittees were established and later on reorganized in 1962. Radiation effects, internal exposure, external exposure, and application recommendations. So the logic that we work in today is that we have the UNSCEAR, the United Nations Scientific Committee for the Effects of Atomic Energy, that collect and put together scientific evidence on different matters of ionizing radiation. They don't make recommendations, they present evidence, scientific evidence. The ICRP, based on this, but other considerations, established the what we call recommendations from the ICRP. And the agency takes into consideration, the agency IAEA takes consideration of the recommendations of the ICRP and establish, working together with the member states, representatives, establish what we call the standards, the international standards of protection. So this is the system. So these are just to recognize some of these very important figures. Just to mention that we now have a program that's interesting for ALU to understand. We have a program called the Marie Curie program, where we have fellowships given to students that are developing their master, only women, only for women, for them to decide where they're going to do their master anywhere in the world, right? I have an intern of this program working with me, so anybody that is a member state of the agency can be a candidate for that, so it's important for you to. And the other one is Lisa Meitner, which is not a fellowship, but it's a scientific visit for women as well. So you can go for a scientific visit in an organization, an institution in the world, so to address one specific topic. And this is very useful when you have one specific issues you want to discuss with a particular group that is developing work in that area. So you can apply for this, and you can find those pages in the IAEA website. Okay, now a bit of the story of nuclear safety regulation. Then these findings reached the public, and the public understanding of the safety of risk of nuclear energy increased demand for stricter regulations on radiation exposure and control of radioactive material. So that demand for strict regulation rose already in the mid of the past century. In the late 50s, public debate raged over the danger of fallout from nuclear testing. Remember that I spoke about the nuclear tests? Some of these tests were conducted in the atmosphere, and then there was the fallout of these tests that contaminated areas over the world. And later on, in the 60s, and then this is when nuclear power started to be considered a way to produce electricity. There were concerns, again, over public radiation exposure from routine operation for nuclear power plants. So it was not nuclear generation for electricity that caused the concern initially, but the initial concern came from the fallout, from the tests in the atmosphere. And again, to respond to public criticism, the American Atomic Energy Commission tightened limits of releases of radioactive material from power plants. And in 1974, radiation protection regulations, only in 1974, radiation protection regulations have been created in the USA and enforced on a federal level by what is now NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So whatever was the Atomic Energy Commission turned out to be NRC. And these regulations, they establish the safety protocol known as ALARA. What is ALARA? And so what? And there is something more. That's the point. That's the point I want to make. Everybody has on the tip of the tongue that ALARA is as low as reasonable, achievable. But there is a continuation to that. Taking into consideration social, economic, and environmental aspects. And what it is, social, economic, and environmental aspects? These are the pillars of sustainability. So the concept of sustainability has always been part of radiation protection. Always been part. Because what we were telling, the community was telling, is that, right, the, where I was there? Releases need to be limited as low as, not practical, but low as reasonable, but consider the social and economic aspects of that. But people decided to have the interpretation that ALARA is as low as practical and does not take into consideration the other dimensions that is part of the definition. So our conversation is very interesting because the concept we're talking about has always been present, but it was not clear and was not treated that way. And the commitment was to get public confidence that the releases could be almost close to zero. But then there is a trick in all this, because everything has been developed for the sake of artificial radionuclides. The whole system was envisaged for one specific situation. At that time, we were not talking about decommissioning. We were not talking about remediation. Not at all. We were talking about something else. But then, what happened? We took this framework, that was the only one we had, and then we applied to other things, like norm, natural radiation. We applied for remediation, for decommissioning, and then we start seeing problems, because the overall thinking was developed for a different situation that could be manageable. And that was the way that nuclear got acceptance, by telling the people that the releases were almost meaningless. But when we apply those things for the kind of things we are working here, then we start seeing that there are issues in this regard. And this is where we fit in. And there's a lot of discussions about how to work with that. So, everything is based on the assumption that there is a linearity. This is for you, huh, in the exercise. There is a linearity between dose and effect, cancer risk. So if there is a linearity from 0 to whatever, what is the safest dose that you can find? Well, if any increment of dose correspond to an increment of risk, what is the only dose that will take no risk? 0 dose. That's what we see here. But definitely, there are many discussions if this approach is really valid. We don't know. We don't know that. But this is what we use as the way to deal with radiation protection. We reduce the dose, we reduce the risk. Very good. And definitely, we have been able to reduce exposures dramatically over time for different types of situation. So the application of this principle in terms of reducing doses to practices have worked pretty well. And the industry is managing to deal with that. But then, let me give you this perspective here. Let's see under a different angle. And this is where I want to take your attention to. So, and this is, by the way, it's not mine. I want to give credit to those who do the good work. Abel Gonzalez, for me, is one of the critical persons in the whole radiation protection history. And he was a director in IAEA for over 20 years. And it's always nice to listen to him. And what he proposes is that in this, you can see the dose, and in here you see the probability of the effect. So in the higher doses, the effects are clinically observable at individual level. This is very important, in an individual level. So that effect will be manifested by means of burns, radiation sickness, and death, because the dose is so strong that will cause an effect on your body, right? And we know what kind of level is this. Now, when we move away from this area, the effects can only be statistically observable, not in individuals, but in populations. And this is the realm of epidemiology. That's what I mentioned before. You cannot attribute an effect to an individual, but you can attribute effect to a population. And then you can do that through epidemiological studies, right? And then there is a very low level range of doses where the effects, they are biologically plausible because of what I discussed in terms of linearity of the effects, right? They are plausible, not probable, right? And if we are honest, under the prevailing circumstances, we need to say, well, if there is an increase in the exposure, there is a proportional increase in the risk. But that's not the whole expression of the truth because of the uncertainties that we talked about. So, in this area of defects, we have inference. In this, we have a collective attribution, and here we have individual attribution. The thing is that we are working in remediation, in most of the cases, not here, eventually here and here. So when we talk about effects, we are talking about effects that can be demonstrated through epidemiological studies, or we can assume that effect is possible. But to demonstrate that, you cannot do that by means of individual attribution. This is crucial in our conversation. And this is why many people are led to misunderstanding, because they believe that effects of low doses can be directly attributed to a consequence. Doses, to one another, you understand? This is very important. This is really very important. The point is, depending on the dose, the epidemiological study, to have a power to be accepted, will have to have a certain number of individuals. So there are circumstances when you have a very small population that are submitted to a very small dose, calculated, not measured, calculated. And then when you want to run an epidemiological study in that particular population, you don't have the number of people enough to run a significant epidemiological study. That's the case in many circumstances. And there was another problem that led a lot of people to make mistakes, was about Chernobyl. Because we, in optimization, I will talk about this principle in a while, we make use of the collective dose. Maybe there is individual dose, and this is a collective dose. And collective dose is the summation of the individual doses of a population, right? And there was the risk of cancer, that is 10 to the minus 2. So what people made was to multiply the risk for the number of the collective dose and infer the number of people that would have cancer. But that was an artifact. For optimization is not a scientific practice. So when the number of people in Chernobyl that was exposed were submitted to an estimated dose, you added all the doses and you multiply by the risk factor, you came up with a number. And this number was used to say, these are the number of people that will die because of the accident of Chernobyl. And that was never confirmed. Because something was misused. One thing is to optimize based on the collective dose, and the other thing is scientifically attribute the number of people that would die or would have cancer by means of this particular approach, which is not correct. So we need to be careful when we when we deal with those things. So, what are the 3 principles of radiation protection? This is something that is core to our business. We have a master program being developed, by the way. It's called MINDER, or MINDER. It is Master in Decommissioning and Environmental Remediation. There is a pool of organizations that are part of this. Is in the European EC program Erasmus Mundus, and there are 4 or 5 high education institutions that are part of the consortium. One is the leading organization is the Porto University in Portugal. Second one is the University for Life Science in Norway, the Hasselt University in Belgium. The 4th one is, I'm missing one, my own institute, Brazil Institute of Radiation Protection and Dosimetry. And the 5th one is the University of Prague in Czech Republic. That will be taking care of decommissioning, right? So these 5 institutions put together efforts to have a consortium, and this consortium has a curriculum that was based pretty much on this training program, and then this will be supposed to be launched next year. It is funded by the European Commission under this program, Erasmus Mundus. And the very first thing, working to support this initiative, the very first thing is that nobody can do anything in remediation and decommissioning without understanding radiation protection. Because this is the leading, this is the basis of everything we do. If we don't understand this, we are pretty much prone to make very serious mistakes. So the first principle we need to talk about is the justification. What does it tell us? So anything that will reduce or remove the radiation exposure situation should do more good than harm. You can just summarize. Whatever we do in terms of radiation should provide a net benefit that outweighs the negative effects. If you will do something that will cause more damage than benefit, you should not do that. Seems very reasonable to think about it. And this is also valid for remediation. For example, when you remove the soil, you are reducing the contamination, but you are killing the fertile layer of the soil. You are causing a radioecological problem, because you lose fertility of the soil. So you need to measure whether removing the soil is really the best solution, or if you have other remediation strategies that can be more effective, like, for example, adding what they call enhancement of soil by adding compounds that would compete for the absorption by the plant in relation to the contaminant that you are dealing with. Phytoremediation is not what I'm talking about, but phytoremediation is always taught because the plant will take it from the soil, but the process can be very long. The uptake cannot be that efficient. But we heard from a lady working with us in Japan that what you can do is to cultivate in that soil something that will not take the radionuclide from the soil. And she gave the example of wine. In Japan, they start producing wine in a soil that was affected by the Fukushima accident, and the radionuclide was not going into the wine. So you need to balance different options for remediation, because remediation, as you will see, is focused on reducing the doses. So you need to be creative in thinking about what you can do. So the other principle is optimization that we introduce when we talk about the ALARA principle. But you see, as low as reasonable achievable with economic, societal, and environmental factors being taken into account. And then the one that is about limitation of the dose, the use of control over the exposure of an individual to ensure that the radiation risk is acceptable. So these are the three principles of radiation protection: justification, optimization, and limitation. First you justify, then you optimize, then you limit the dose. Okay? It's clear? Are we comfortable so far? Excellent. So, now let's talk about remediation. What is the definition of remediation? Remediation can be defined as anything that reduces the radiation exposure due to existing contamination of land. Sorry, there was a mistake here. By actions applied to the contamination itself, the source, or to the exposure pathways to human. Whether you interfere in the source, right? Or you interfere in the pathway that we discussed in the first presentation from the source to humans. What can we do? Well, complete removal of the contamination is not implied. The member states coming to the agency, agreed that remediation does not necessarily imply in the full removal of the contamination. You did this with your eyes, I could see. Why?
I think it's important, it's necessary to remediation.
It is, but when I say that the full removal of contamination is not implied, you don't.
Why not imply?
Why not implied? Why the full? Please stop me and ask when you are not comfortable with anything. I just spotted her because I'm looking to you, and I say that she was uncomfortable with that, and that's always a very important question. I would say a fundamental question: why the complete removal of contamination is not implied? Just because what I said. Because there will be some levels of contamination in which we can definitely say that the risks will not be such that will compensate the investment that you need to put in to go to that level of decontamination. In other words, you are not gaining anything by removing the contamination. Moreover, I can tell you that there were circumstances, believe me or not, I will not give detailed information about it, but there were circumstances, there was a decision that a population living in a contaminated area should leave that area. The only problem is that the area where they were sent to naturally had a higher background than the area where they were living. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. This is true. You understand what I say? You were living in a contaminated area with a certain background, and then there was a decision, oh, this is dangerous, so let's relocate these people. And the place where they were relocated to had a background of radiation higher than the area that they were living at. So this is ridiculous. So important is, but you don't need to accept everything I say. You don't need to accept, you need to contest. You need to try me. But I'm telling you that the idea is that the complete removal of the contamination is not implied. If I can draw something very quickly here, if we plot in a graphic like this, the cost of decontamination escalate linearly, right? The benefit, on the other hand, has this behavior. It means that from a certain point, you increase the cost dramatically, right? But the benefit you get in terms of dose, this is the dose, this is the cost. So the cost that you are putting there to reduce the dose in the beginning, it makes a lot of sense. But after a certain point, the gain you get is marginal. So you are putting a lot of money, but you are getting anything out of that. So this is why we say that the complete removal of contamination is not implied. You may wish to do it. You may wish to spend as much money as you want. Nobody will say, well, unless if you ask the people that say, look, I'll give an example. The best thing is give examples, right? Which makes it more credible. I was discussing with the mayor of a city in Japan, and he made a confidence to me. He said, the federal government is putting money in my city that correspond to 100 years of budget. But the problem I have is not the contamination. The problem I have is that the elderly, the old people, are living alone because the youngsters, they left the city. And I need money not to decontaminate, I need money to take care of these people. But they cannot use the money for that. I can only use the money for decontamination. And then the question is, maybe if the level of contamination was reassessed, people would not need to leave. So these are questions that we need to ask ourselves, because the first approach we have in mind is essentially, let's do it. Let's get rid of this bloody contamination, right? And then we need to spend a lot of money on that. And you have competing demands for money that could make a more important contribution at different levels. So this is why we have Giuseppe and Katrina with us, to take account of the social dimension of these decisions. Because if it was only technical decision, I could take care of that. I can take care of that. But I cannot take care of the social aspects. It's more complicated, far more complicated. Use of the terms cleanup, rehabilitation, and restoration should not be used as synonymous for remediation. Because remediation does not mean that you need to bring back the site for a beneficial use, although circularity will tell something different. And restoration tells that you bring the site to its original function, which is not implied in remediation. And what about cleanup? Well, you will understand this later. Remediation can entail activities that are similar to decommissioning, because decommissioning is not only focused on the installation, but is also focused on the land. And many people who deal with decommissioning forget about it. They think about dismantling, they think about decontamination of the installation, but they forget that the soil should also be addressed, right? Both remediation activities, remediation and decommissioning, are typically performed under an authorization. You have to have an authorization for that. Abandoned and presently unauthorized industrial sites, such as former uranium mines and mills, and former radium processing facilities, may have buildings and structures that are taken down by action consistent with the decommissioning process, like decontamination and dismantling. However, such activities are considered to be part of site remediation in the cases that this was not an authorized practice. And the term cleanup is essentially used in the context of decommissioning, and I will explain this in a while. What is typically covered by remediation? I think, oh my God. Okay. So, we are talking about past activities that were not stringently regulated, where the termination of the activity and the handling of the remaining residues most probably were not adequately considered when the activity was initiated. And activities involving mining and meeting of ore contain naturally applied substances. Long-term prolonged presence of radioactive residues from accidents and other unforeseen events that were not adequately managed, and radioactive residues from military activities such as nuclear weapon production and testing. So, in summary, everything that was done improperly and remains. So this is what remediation is about. But I mentioned that in my first presentation. Some important definitions and state, and we have a glossary that you should be aware of, because when we are in a conversation, we need to understand that the same concept that I use is understood by you, because we have different understanding about the same concept. We got nowhere. Nowadays we see with the social media, we talk about right, left, extreme left, and everyone has an understanding about these terms, and that's a big confusion. Nobody knows more what we are talking about. So we need to define what we understand as that specific term. And this is why the safety glossary is very important, because it defines a common understanding of specific terms. So end state, I will skip radioactive waste, but in terms of decommissioning, it's about activities at the final state of decommissioning of a facility and used in relation to remediation as the final status of a site at the end of its activities for decommissioning and remediation, including approval of the radiological and physical conditions of the site remaining structures. So when you think about remediation, you need to think about what kind of end state we will be considering. We need to start with the end in mind. As a colleague of mine would say, you cannot start a journey without knowing where you are going to, because any destination is good enough, and we don't know where we're going to go to, right? Important resource is the remediation strategy and process for areas affected by past activities or events. And then we see that in this report, in the safety guide of the agency, right, we see already the presence of the word sustainability. But this was approved recently. So the concept of sustainability in our guides started to be introduced very recently. Okay? So it talks about preference for technologies that take account sustainability principles. So we already talked about this. We also talk about objectives can be largely achievable to sustainable approach, involve a more moderate degree of remediation. And also we speak about selection and achievement of remediation and state that should consider long-term protection while balancing any short-term impact. So some keywords, they start popping up in our conversation, like balancing, making a compromise. You know, this is part of the things we are doing. So, we have, at the end of the day, and this is a very important thing, two situations that are relevant to us. Planned exposure situations, and you need to really understand this. Planned exposure situation and existing exposure situations. What is a planned exposure situation? An exposure situation that results from the deliberate introduction and operation of radiation sources, used for their radioactive properties. For this type of situation, the use of source is understood, and as such, the exposures can be anticipated and controlled from the beginning. That means that for planned exposure situation, we use what we call dose limit. So when you introduce an activity that will increase the dose, like a nuclear power plant, like a uranium mining, when you introduce that, you need to justify, you need to optimize, and you will establish those limits that should not be exceeded. This is a planned exposure situation. And decommissioning is part of planned exposure situation. Now, there is another one, which is existing exposure situation. What is the difference here? I know it's a pain in the ass, but bear with me because this is critical for our conversation. An exposure situation resulting from a source that already exists. Here, the source does not exist, it will be introduced. Here, it already exists. It happened, an accident happened. What you inherit from the past is already there. when you need to do something about it. You're not introducing anything. It already exists, it's already there. Then, no intention to use the source for its radioactive properties before a decision to control the resulting exposure is taken. Decisions on the need of control of the exposure may be necessary, eventually not urgent. This is questionable. It will be a case-by-case decision, but there are many circumstances in which the source is there for long periods of time, and it will not cause any damage from day to night. But still, we need to fix this. But then, we don't talk about dose limit anymore. We talk about reference level. And this is where many people make big mistakes, where they take the dose levels for planned exposure situations and apply the limits in the case of existing exposure situation. I think this diagram makes it more clear. So this is a situation of a planned exposure situation. You see that there is a dose limit, which is 1 millisievert per year. You may have heard about it many times. There is a dose constraint of 0.30 millisievert per year, and below that is where you optimize until 10 microsievert per year. Each one of this has a meaning. It comes from one specific circumstance. So this one comes from the epidemiological studies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This one here is a fraction of that one because a nuclear power plant, in principle, has more than one reactor. So if you assign for one reactor the limit of 1, in conjunction, the nuclear power plant with more than one reactor will cause a dose that is above 1, right? So you put a fraction to each one of them so that in the totality they will not exceed this value. And the value of optimization, 10 microsievert per year, why we choose this value? That it's about a risk of 10 to the minus 6, which is trivial risk, the risk which we are all subjected. So it doesn't make any sense to reduce the risks due to something that we introduce that is below the risks that we are all subjected as individuals. So this is the situation that applies to planned exposure situation, in which decommissioning is part of. And then there is the existing exposure situation. And then there was an agreement that a reference level, which is a level that you should not accept that it would be exceeded, you should be below that level, and also think about optimization. That level can be selected between 1 and 20 millisievert, which can be above. This one is the lower level here, you see? And the ceiling is 20 millisievert per year. And then you may ask, but what the hell? This one is not applied here. It's a good question, right? And that's the answer is that here you have all the controls to make it as low as possible. And in here, you have situations in which naturally people are exposed to doses in this range. And it was not a situation where you exerted any control. It already exists. You may decide, obviously, to choose a value that is 1 millisievert per year. But to deal with something that was created in the past, you will need to balance the cost and benefit, but also other criteria to reach a decision of what number to pick in this range. And this is where multi-criteria decision analysis come into play. It's not only the cost, there are other things that you need to consider. And what we are trying to do here this week is to help you to make decisions in how you can make these decisions in terms, among other things, to define reference levels to be applied in remediation. For decommissioning, it's clear. In principle, you have to, in the decommissioning phase, you have to abide, you have to comply with the same level that was attributed during the operational phase. But in remediation, the situation is different. You need to pick up a number in the range of 1 and 20 millisievert per year. And to do that, you need to take into consideration different criteria that goes beyond cost. And this is where things get complicated. Right? Any doubt here? Any comment? You are very quiet. I'm worried. These are situations where everybody is understanding everything, or it's a complete mess. Now we'll see in the exercise. This is why exercises are important. But then you say, can you explain me why cleanup is used in here and not in here? And now you understand. Because when we speak about remediation, we are speaking about this framework. And what people don't want to see is this framework being transported to this situation here. So this is why many people and the agency prefers to call remediation, which is exactly the same activities. Whatever you do here technically is the same thing that you do here. But to avoid confusion, we don't speak about remediation because it brings this framework to here. Just a matter of avoiding confusion. So the work has to be done in the site where the installation is operating. If there is any contamination, will be pretty much the same work that will be done in here. But to avoid this confusion, to bring that framework to this situation, here we speak about cleanup, and here we speak about remediation. That was the explanation I was owing you back in my presentation. Right? So, another way to see that. Imagine that you have your installation here, right? This is your installation, and this installation has been licensed. It is a planned exposure situation. You plan for that, you got a license. So, the releases of this installation to the environment cannot exceed 1 millisievert per year to the reference person that was in the past called members of the critical group, the more exposed population. Now we speak about reference person. So these doses cannot exceed 1 millisievert per year. So we are pretty much in this circumstance here. And when decommissioning takes place, what we should have is something that is left for unrestricted use. You can do everything you want with this site. This site will be looking at something like this. A green field, although many people hate this denomination, a green field. But what we really we really have to speak in technical terms in the scope of the agency work is unrestricted use, meaning no restriction is applied. If you want to have a kindergarten here, you would be able to have it. If you want to have a camping, you could have it. If you want to have a farmer that would cultivate in the soil, that would pump water from the well, you could have it. Unrestricted use, right? But now, in case you have an accident, in case you have an accident, and the accident not only affect the area, but also extrapolate the area of the fence of the facility, then you don't have a planned exposure situation. You don't plan for an accident. What you have is an existing exposure situation, and you not apply this limit, but you will apply a remediation, reference level to remediation between 1 and 20 millisievert per year, right? And definitely, you may not be able to have a green field in the area that has been affected. But then we can have other things to do. Now, what is the problem? First of all, you need to understand that and this is critical, you decommission a facility. And a facility is the installation and the associated land. The land that is associated to the installation, and land includes soil and groundwater. So when you talk about decommissioning, you're not talking about only about the installation. You're talking about the associated land, because the objective is to remove all the regulations from the facility and bring it to a state that desirably is for unrestricted use. Now, the problem is that there are many facilities that mix components of planned and existing exposure situations. I give an example. Sellafield in UK is a very classical example. It's a facility that brings together different types of industrial units. It works in a license, but it has components that characterize that facility as a legacy site, like waste buried in trenches and other type of contamination of groundwater, because this was not licensed properly in the past. It's under a license now, but in the past it was not licensed. And it may be the case that bring such kind of facility to this condition may not be sustainable, may not be the optimal solution. It's what the NEA, OECD, they call complex sites, where you have a situation that is not black and white. So it's a more complicated situation, right? Poços de Caldas definitely is not there because it was licensed. Some people say, oh, Poços de Caldas is a mining site in Brazil, is a legacy site. No, it's not. It's a licensed site, there was a formal license, and you need to abide to this principle here. Although, you can demonstrate that it may not be the sustainable solution, but that's a different conversation. But in principle, this is. In Central Asia, definitely, you're talking about existing exposure situation, because none of that was licensed. Things were done disregarding safety considerations. But not impedes you to adopt values that are very restrictive, compatible with a planned exposure situation in a remediation. You can do that. The range is 1 to 20. You can decide to do 1. But the point is, how much are you going to pay for that? And for example, I'm not sure if I have here. No. Yeah, let me talk about this one here. Now, this is a situation that was, this is something that was developed by my colleague Anna Clark when she was in NEA OECD. You see, this is a site. And this is the different situations in which, and you will deal with that with your exercise, you see. You may decide to remove all the waste from the site. But look, the number of trucks correspond to the number, or to the amount of waste that you will be removing. So, if you have a lot of trucks, you have higher CO2 emissions. You need to have a disposal site. You will be increasing the risk of accidents, of noise for the local population because you have more trucks circulating, among other things. So you may wish to reduce the amount of trucks of waste that will be removed from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and keeping some of the waste, potentially not the most dangerous waste, keep some of the waste on site, like you can see here. And you can provide somehow reasonable options to stabilize the waste on site. You can have a mixture. And eventually, the site might not be released for unrestricted use, but you can use the site for very specific uses that may include industrial development, not for housing, not for a kindergarten, but still have the site being used for some specific purpose that is compatible with the amount of materials that will be left over there. For example, if you leave the site like this for unrestricted use, it may be the case that in the future somebody wants to dig the site and take the material to do something with the material, and then you heat contaminated material. But if you put the site into some beneficial use that is not for unrestricted use, the controls you have over the site will prevent this from happening. You understand what I mean? So you need to make a decision about that. I mean, there are some situations in which you have purely decommissioning activities. You have situations where you have purely remediation activities, but there are some things that are more or less in the middle, and you need to use common sense to do that. So, coming back to my slides, I will go fast over this. Important to have policies and strategies where many things is defined, and many countries have difficulties in doing remediation because of the lack of policy and strategies that will define, among other things, in the policy level, what kind of interaction you're going to have with the stakeholders, right? You may have different approaches, like communicate. You can have surveys. You can have different ways to communicate to stakeholders, but you can decide to have a participatory decision-making process where the stakeholders are part of the decision. And this is definitely something that should be defined in policies for remediation. And this is very important that you communicate those things to your management. So we saw in the training course that policy is very important, because that will define the position of the country in relation of that specific activity. And the regulations will need to be aligned with the policies. We have also a report that talks about how to determine end state, right? And we speak about strategic level and tactical level, but what is important here is that we introduce what are the enablers for end state definition, like, for example, national policy, legal and regulatory framework, national waste management strategy, confidence of interest parties in the process, decisions, and end state. But it's really important that we make reference to interim end state, because sometimes, due to the complexity of the site, you know, I mean, I mentioned these sites where it's a bit white and a bit black. It's very difficult to define what the end state will be, because the work will need to take over 100 years to be accomplished. So define an end state that can only be materialized in 100 years. God knows what will happen in 100 years. So it may be the case that it's more prudent to define an interim end state that is to be achieved in the next decade, in the next 2 decades, which is much shorter time. And then that interim end state, when you reach that interim end state, you will examine the situation for the definition of the end, the final end state. So this was the experience we had from those that contributed to us to develop this document here, this publication. And it's a solution that we may have for those that are dealing with very complex sites in which the definition of end state is not possible in the short term. Also, the idea of sustainability being incorporated in remediation has been published. I had the chance to work with this publication here of the NEA OECD, and we talked about adaptive remediation, so that it's a phased approach, which is a more interactive process, that you will calibrating your measures the way you go. You don't jump into a final solution, but you will adapt according to the information you get. About the zoning of operable or management units, like you can see here, you will shrink the areas that you are working with in your planning, so that you will leave a very small footprint, but you will manage that in a gradual reduction. It's also a matter of planning, right? You have to consider the use of long-term stewardship, the waste management constraints, the stakeholder opinion and expectations, the commissioning constraints, environmental constraints, and most important, funding constraints. You may not have the whole money to do what you have to do all at once. So you will gradually develop your strategy so that you can adapt to the boundary conditions that you are facing. Okay? So this is just a schematic. There will be different mechanisms in which you can use to define the end state. But what is important here is that you have a very good characterization of the site. And this is something important in what you will be doing. If you want to do something, you need what is there. And then you will define what kind of potential uses can be attributed to that site. You need to determine the requirements to meet in the case of the reference levels. You need to define if there is sufficient information. Are the requirements met? Determine the remedial action. The remedial action is acceptable, feasible, and sustainable. Implement remedial action until the achievement of the end state. But if you see that remedial action is not acceptable, is not feasible, and most of all is not sustainable, you then need to reevaluate the remedial action. It's a very interactive process that you need to involve the different stakeholders in this process. And important is that you have a very good characterization, and that characterization will feed the conceptual site model that you had in the beginning to refine your understanding about the source, about the site. Sometimes you think you know the site you are dealing, but then you discover there was something else there that it was not apparent in the beginning of the process. So you need to be very careful about this. We had a similar project for decommissioning, and people ask why you have two different projects. Stupidity, pure stupidity. We should have worked together. I should not be telling those things here, but I don't care. But you will see that whatever you have in here for decommissioning, you have more or less reflected in the remediation. So the only thing that the conduct means completion of decommissioning. Completion of decommissioning is to achieve the end state. So The same things you saw in the other document, you see here. Radiological criteria, physical status. You also need to consider non-radiological criteria. A lot of uncertainties is very important. The end state options, the decision-making process, multi-attribute analysis. You see that they make reference to what we are talking about. That's nice. Evolution of end state definition, interim end states. We spoke about the same thing in the other document. Characterization, very important, pretty much the same in the other document. And then extent of cleanup activities. So you will see that there is not much difference. What is the difference? That the framework are different. Framework for remediation is one, legal framework for decommissioning is another one. But in terms of the activities, pretty much the same. Okay, I can skip this one, though this is very complex as well. About decommissioning, the timing and pace can be constrained because you cannot progress linearly with the decommissioning activities. Sometimes you will find a more difficult tasks to be done. So you need to account for that. So important to understand that potentially the reuse of facility can be something that you will take into consideration. But the message that I want to give is this one here. Decommissioning may entertain activities that have a very overlap with uranium mine site, but you have minor environmental contamination. There are situations in decommissioning and waste management interact. No major environmental contamination. What you'll be doing essentially is putting down buildings and structures, and you will generate waste, but the environment, soil and groundwater are not really contaminated. In the case of, this is cases in which nuclear power plants operate, the new nuclear power plants with very small footprint. Situations in which you have remediation and waste management, but you don't have decommissioning. Typically, the case of accidents, there is no decommissioning. Off-site area, there is no decommissioning. Just remediation activities and waste management. But there are situations in which you can have the three of them taking place simultaneously. You will have a decommissioning, you have remediation, and you have waste management. In the case of decommissioning, we would call cleanup for the reasons I gave to you. But the important thing here is that these things need to be sustainable, and to that you need to have holistic understanding of the process that you are dealing with. This is my final recommendation to you. You need to think holistic about the things. I heard from a friend that there are different generations, the baby boomers, generation X, Z, Y, whatever. But I heard about the generation T. The generation T is such that in my time, I was asked to be very deep in my knowledge in one specific topic. And that's what I was expected to deliver. A deep knowledge on what I was doing. But today, this deep knowledge is still necessary, but you have an horizontal knowledge that is also necessary. And this horizontal knowledge will hit different areas that you will not have a deep understanding, but you will see in which way what you are doing interact with other areas. You don't need to be expert in everything, because it's pretty much impossible. But you need to understand how these things are related to and connected. So this is the holistic thinking that is very much necessary today. If you don't have this holistic thinking, you definitely will incur in the risk of making serious mistakes. So, the bottom line I want to make is that ALARA, in general sense, convey a message that is perceives that residual contamination should tend to zero. Madam? But that's not the case. ALARA protocol has successfully limited the exposure of radiation works to values well below 1 millisieverts per year and even less. But in the case of remediation of contaminated sites, this might not be quite straightforward, because the costs related to these interventions can be extremely high. Let's keep in mind that ALARA also calls for taking into consideration social and economic aspects, although this part is less prominent, particularly on public perception. But the environmental, social, and economic dimension, these are the pillars of sustainability. So this is why we are here, how to do this. As a result, sustainability was always implicit in the expanded ALARA principle, but was not seen as such. So the question is, how to bring sustainability into decision-making of ALARA. This is what we are doing here during this week. Combining something that was already there with the sustainability concepts, but in a very practical way. And that can only be achieved by integrating these three dimensions in a way that it is feasible, doable, and this is what we will be doing here. What is safe, what is sustainable? Land remediation is framed by what is safe, and environmental safety must be made. An environmental safety case must be made. I'm not advocating at all to relax safety. That's not what I'm talking about here. But definitely there are different types of things to consider. Reuse of material and assets, like the land, and this will be my next presentation. Very important to get good record keeping, and proactive change control should be established early to proportionately manage uncertainty. And this is critical in the overall process, to manage uncertainty. You will see that I will provoke you in your exercise on this one. I just want to make this disclaimer that although I'm supposed to speak on behalf of the agency, I put a lot of my personal touch in some of these comments. So take it into consideration, because I believe that it's important to bring additional than what is on the standards, the practice, the experience, what is going on in the real world to our conversation, right? I think we can stop by now, but before that, I ask you if there is any question, any comments. And I will always say, disagreements are also welcome. You are very quiet. I'm pretty worried with that.
I have a question.
Yes.
What about exemption of site from regulatory control? Where is it stage in this meeting?
So this was a question I was expecting. Exemption. There are two concepts that we use in radiation protection, which is exemption and clearance. And this is really boring for people, because these concepts exist for a reason. But not everybody wants to go into this. but they are important. Exemption. You exempt something from control because the control is not justified. You should not control things that could potentially be controlled, but the control is not the best way of doing because the risks that are associated to that are not relevant. So why you want to control things that should not be controlled? In other words, some people would say that we should control everything. Let's put these things into extremes. One vision is that we should control everything. The other vision is that we should not control what should not be controlled. We should dedicate our effort, our money, to control things that really matter. So the exemption will not put in the site itself, will not exempt the site. The site will be released from control. And if there is a risk because of the contamination conditions of the site, what you do is to remediate the site, not exempt the site. Right? Also, people say clear the site. You don't clear the site. Clearance is another important point, and clearance is about removing objects, things, from something that is controlled from outside that practice. So if you have something in an activity that is under regulatory control, whatever goes out of that need to be cleared because it has the potential to be contaminated. So you need to demonstrate that the levels of contamination of that object, of that material, is below, yes sir, is below the clearance level. This is a very important waste management tool because you don't want to put things in a waste repository that should not be there. So you don't clear site, you clear objects in authorized activity. Yes, sir?
It is similar to a lot of principle, I think. Very close.
They are all connected. Yeah. But this is what I say. The system is very interesting because it has developed to address different aspects. In the beginning, you were thinking about the releases, the effluent from a facility. But then you realize, oh, wait a minute, but there are things in the facility that might be contaminated, and I need to make sure that these things can go for a restricted use, so they are clearance. Now, there is in another document of the agency, you have a new concept. It's called a specific clearance. What is a specific clearance? It's something similar to what we had in the past called conditional clearance. The material can be taken from the facility, but can only be used in that particular application. Not for everything, but for that particular application only. And the regulatory body should make the efforts and should have the enforcement capability to make sure that the material will be used only for that specific activity and not for something else. Right? And this is very important when we will discuss circularity and sustainability in remediation. Because there are many things that will end up as waste, but those things could be put in beneficial use under certain conditions. I can give an example. Let's think about contaminated soil. You can make soil with cement to make concrete, so to speak. But Can you use this material for anything? Well, no. But you can use it for constructing dikes, constructing bridges, because the exposures in this situation will be meaningless. There will be no major exposure. Oh, but there will be leaching and then we'll go to the environment. Well, we can check all these kind of things. And then you need to compare what is better to get this material being used in a beneficial purpose or to be taking important room, space to be treated as waste where you have a good application for that. So this is where Nazarene is working, in the sense of safety to be addressed, economic analysis to be addressed, but also public acceptance. And you need to demonstrate the safety of this stake and the benefits that you can achieve by doing that. So don't make confusion in terms of exemption, clearance, site release, remediation, and decommissioning. Right? And also keep in mind that in the process you may not be able to jump into clear solutions because the complexity of the site may entail a more adaptive management of the site. It may entail interaction, iterative process, a gradual process in which you will be refining your information over the site and refining the understanding you have about it. Okay? Any other comment, any other question? So let me then ask Tiago, what is the difference between dose limit and reference level?
Dose limit is for a plant exposure, and reference level is for exposure that is not planned, an accident.
This is dangerous, isn't it? Plug it.
Well, dose limit is for a plant exposure, and reference level is for a situation that you're not planned, like accident. And so they have different kind of goals, because for a plant you need to reach the 1 millisievert year, and the other you can study and identify what is the better dose to achieve.
Optimize the dose.
Yeah.
Right? Pass it on to the right.
The right?
Yeah, my right. How do you pick up a reference level? How you decide? We said that reference level is between 1 and 20. How you would decide what could be a good value?
I think we have to to calculate the environmental effect. We have to think about environmental or personal effect that can be affected to human. Maybe we go back to the before the what you say before the first value, the first number of the radiometry, the dose I mean so that will be the reference level for it, I think.
No. Anybody wants to add any additional consideration in the reference level? Catherine? He talked about effects. It's okay. Although we have talked about the difficulties to attribute effects of low doses. But let's just twist a little bit your answer and say we need to take into consideration the potential consequences of exposure to ionizing radiation. But that is one consideration. Now asking, what else you should consider? But pass it on to.
Well, I had a more general question.
Let's finish this one.
Yeah, well, you will see if it's related or not. So in your presentation, you referred mostly to exposures to humans, but now we know that the system of radiological protection also considers exposures to biota. So when we discuss reference levels, should we also consider exposures to biota,
Yep.
which may or may not be protected at a dose similar to humans?
I will not skip that one, and I still on the spot, but let me address this one. My personal perspective is that I'm sticking with the old thinking that if you protect humans, you protect other species. But there is many scientists that put emphasis on protecting biota. But there is a catch in there. In radiation protection, centered in the human being, you protect individual. In terms of protection of non-human species, you need to protect not one individual, but you need to protect the whole community. So it's a different emphasis. You have definitely to consider the biota. There are some estimates of effects, but to my understanding, in my personal opinion, it is pretty adding very big complication to the process, which is already complex. And I have no clear solution for that, my understanding. I'm not a radiobiologist and I'm not working in that. My colleague Diego Tejeria is digging much more on this. I'm restricting myself in this conversation to human-centric approach. But I want to, as you asked me that, I want to refer to a discussion we had recently about what to do with colonies that developed in pipelines of offshore oil and gas platforms, because you see the platforms, you have incrustation of organisms that start living in this substrate. And when you talk about the commissioning of these facilities, there are options to remove everything, the basis, which is quite difficult, because can you imagine the encroachment of a platform in the seabed? But to lift that can be very complicated, but also the pipelines that are in the seabed. And the discussion is essentially that the radiation in the scales in the pipelines can affect the colony of organisms that are incrustated in that. So what to do? Because if we leave these organisms there, they will have the effects of radiation, right? So what's the solution? To remove everything to avoid that the organisms are affected by radiation. But then there's a problem, because when you remove everything, you are killing all of them. So you are trading a probabilistic effect by a deterministic effect, that by removing the structures, you are killing immediately all of the organisms that you are trying to protect. So, something to be considered. I personally, this is my opinion, I think we have a very good framework if we really focus on the principles that I talked about. But I respect those that want to do more holistic analysis in this respect, provided that it's functional and you can demonstrate the benefit of what you're doing.
I think the problem is about the use of the environment, because, for instance, you can say, okay, people do not have to drink water from a lake or something, and then they have a dose which is within the march, but like for the animals living in the water, they cannot get out and not use the water. So
Yeah.
It's not necessarily about the law, but about the way that
Yeah, you
we
need,
use the environment.
the approach really says that you need to consider that. I'm not a specialist in this regard.
Puede ser una cuestión económica también, porque eso es factible de hacerlo, pero eso implica mucho dinero.
Again, she's citing that as an economic situation. Yes, we need to balance all this. That's what we got to do. When I asked the question, it was about what effects, but there are other things to consider. So if in the multi-criteria decision analysis, if you want to include, to value the ecology as something you need to protect by reducing the footprint, that's a decision that has to be made with the information we have right now. We're going to see this because one of the things that we had in the exercise is lakes that are affected by the releases of the plant that we are talking. Okay, any other inputs? Colleagues from Armenia? No? Okay then, let's break